Hello, and welcome to Autology, the weekly podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. This week's episode will center around the ramifications of Russia's ongoing invasion of the Ukraine to the automotive industry. You're here with me, Brian Rhodes, Mark Fulthorpe, S&P Global Mobility Executive Director of Global Production Forecasting, and Matteo Fini, S&P Global Mobility Automotive Vice President of Supply Chain Technology and Aftermarket. Hello to you both, and thanks for joining me on this week's episode of Autology.
Hey, Brian. Pleased to be with you.
Thanks, Brian.
Great. So, Mark, let's start with you. There was pretty recently a major revision to the S&P Global Mobility light vehicle production forecast just after the invasion began. Do you mind giving us some details on what those changes were and what the outlook is for car production in light of all this?
Yeah, no problem at all. So it's light vehicle production that would be looking at, Brian, just to make sure that everybody's aware of that. So passenger cars in the commercial sector, up to 6 tons gross vehicle weight. So that's our perimeter. And I guess, against the backdrop of recent major corrections, that really has sort of been a feature of the forecast for the last 18, 24 months as we've moved through the various, crises, starting with COVID and then into semiconductor supply chain for most of 2021. Now we're faced with the compounding effects of, as you said, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we had to kind of, stop and consider what kind of changes we needed to make. I think it's important also to point out that this is going to be, it's going to be an iterative development of the forecast over the next few months. But certainly in the first assessment, we focused on 3 main areas. The first was, the direct impact on manufacturing activity within Russia and Ukraine themselves. So we've effectively zeroed the output in Ukraine. And then for Russia itself, we're expecting that there will be severe reductions in the number of vehicles coming off the end of a production line. So we've got that factor. It's probably, if we said current year, it's probably a hit of around about, 800,000 units or so for Russia. The other thing which is emerging, and I'm sure Matteo will touch on this, is, we're getting sort of a direct impact from disruption to the supply chain, which is situated in Ukraine, typically in the western side of the country. So perhaps hasn't faced as much, physical damage as other parts of the country yet. But that is a concern because there are a number of sectors and suppliers who've located to Ukraine in order to provide a cost-effective supply base for manufacturing operations, typically in Central Europe, but also in some of the major facilities back in Western Europe. So we've got that effect coming through. Most of what we're focused on at the moment, where we've seen immediate impact, has been around wiring harnesses. And again, I'm sure there'll be conversation around that to follow. And then the third thing that we have looked at in this initial assessment phase is what we're calling demand destruction. And just to kind of put that in context, probably for most of the last couple of years, what we've been imagining is that, once we got through COVID, once we got through disruption to primarily semiconductor supply chains, but other supply chains as well, those which have been dislocated because of the COVID outbreaks, we did assume that there would be quite significant levels of significant pent-up or deferred demand, which would be available for the auto industry to satisfy, and also that there would be strong activity required to rebuild inventory levels And we don't expect them to rebuild to the kind of levels that existed prior to the COVID situation, but there's still room to fill those out. Because of the impact of the Russian invasion and its knock-on effects across the kind of the broader macro economy, typically creating inflationary pressures, oil and gas, so for heating and lighting, obviously it's more expensive to fill the tank of a vehicle right now as well. And all of this is going to erode both physically in terms of the amount of disposable income consumers have, and certainly in the short term, it will probably have a negative effect on consumer sentiment as well. But if we think about it more in the midterm, just when we expected supply chains to be restored, we were looking for this, this boost in activity, and it could well be that boost in activity is going to be hugely moderated because of the macroeconomic contagion from the Russian invasion. So I think those are the three broad areas that we're considering at the moment, Brian.
Yeah, I'm curious on that third point now. Is this something that is sort of a global thing, this potential reduction of demand, or is it specific to maybe Eastern Europe?
I think we'd probably expect to see, relative negative impacts in most major markets around the world. Certainly markets where oil and gas are key commodities. Whether it's a pump price in the US, whether it's domestic heating prices, here in Europe, it's all going to have a corrosive effect on people's financial well-being, and that's why we kind of we play it out more as a negative impact across mid to long term of our forecast horizon, and why it's very difficult to seek to isolate any major economy at this stage.
Got it. So yeah, you mentioned this point on supply chain. That's definitely where I want to go next. So if we move beyond the plant production of vehicles themselves and even the selling of the vehicle themselves, Matteo, could you shed some light on what components of the vehicle are particularly under pressure due to this crisis, and also maybe just level set what types of companies are operating in the Ukraine or potentially in Russia that are being impacted?
Yeah, Brian, it's so Ukraine, I would say, is not necessarily a country associated with a major, component manufacturing hub, with the exception of wiring harnesses. So just for context, wiring harnesses are, well, there's about 5 kilometers of wires in the average car, and wiring harnesses are these bundles of wires which allow effectively the transfer of signal and power within different parts of the vehicle. It's a very labor-intensive component, mostly made in places where labor costs are as low as possible. And Ukraine does have that characteristic with labor costs that are about even a third of neighboring countries. No? So that has made Ukraine a big investment hub for wiring harnesses, together with the Balkan countries, countries like Montenegro, Serbia, as well as North Africa. So from an exposure standpoint, it's mostly wiring harnesses. So they had, I think last year, about 1.5 billion worth of wiring harnesses going out of Ukraine into mostly Germany and Poland. About half of that went to Germany and Poland. And it's not directly tier one business. What do I mean by that? I mean, a supplier in Ukraine supplying into an OEM in Germany or France. There's a lot of wiring harnesses flows that are going from Ukraine into Poland, and then in Poland they are effectively assembled into bigger wiring bundles, if you will, no, and then being shipped over to, again, countries like Germany, as well as France, UK, Italy, and so on. So yeah, it's that's where most of the exposure is. and of course, this is what has caused already some production disruption in facilities at Volkswagen and BMW. So those are the two car makers that to date are most exposed, well, in general, are exposed to Ukrainian sourcing. It's not just that. There's also, some seat cover operations that are taking place in Ukraine, mostly exposing the likes of Audi and BMW too. But yeah, so definitely wiring harnesses is a major concern. Now, this is not to say that facilities over there have stopped producing. Because as Mark was saying, most of these facilities are in the west of the country. The west of Ukraine is currently not undergoing major, I would say, operations, and we have anecdotal knowledge of some of these facilities still effectively burning through their inventory of wires. It does help the fact that most of the staff at these plants is actually female, and therefore they're not being summoned for military operation or military service, right? And so yeah, so some production is going, but of course, even when they produce these wires, they cannot ship those out of the country very, very easily. All of the checkpoints in Poland, as well as other neighboring countries, are obviously dealing with much more important problems than wiring harnesses, and this is obviously the flow of refugees and so on. And therefore, it is definitely a problem, and various measures are being pursued to try to reduce the impact, primarily moving production out of Ukraine in favor of those other countries I mentioned before, so Balkan states as well as North Africa. Because without saying, it's easier said than done, right? So it will take some time for them to move production away from into those other facilities, and assuming again that capacity does exist for them to accommodate this relocation of production.
Yeah, I think fresh on everyone's mind, of course, is the chip crisis, right? And one question I have is, something we learned through the chip crisis is we've got some aspects of these chips that are potentially stopping a vehicle from being sold, and some that are decontenting a car. When we talk about wire harnesses, what way does that go? Would that prevent a vehicle from being able to be sold to a customer?
Yeah, so it is definitely worse than with the chips, because fundamentally you cannot make the car, and it's also very complex, because essentially wiring harnesses are built upon these custom made jigs, if that makes any sense. So it's like you have this piece of wood on which there are a bunch of pins, and then you have people that are laying wires onto those pins, and that has to be done in a specific order, which is trim dependent, it is engine dependent, so it is very custom made for each configuration. And and therefore, if you don't have the precise one for the specific setup of vehicle that you're trying to manufacture, you cannot make that car. And of course, there are, if you think about the fact that you have on the average car, let's say 30, 40 ECUs that all need to be connected. The moment you start not having wires, you have a bunch of features in the vehicles that suddenly cannot function, let alone also the electricity distribution in the vehicle, which is obviously another major constraint that you have. So yeah, it's much worse than with the semiconductors from that feasibility perspective.
Got it. So as this crisis goes on, obviously a lot of unknown, right? There's unknown from the very beginning, and we're all staying tuned to daily news updates, it seems. Any other components or parts of the vehicle do you think that people should pay attention to in terms of some risk as this continues?
I think linked directly to Ukraine, with the exception of seat covers that I mentioned before. We have other factors to look at with greater attention than we have historically. There's been discussions around the semiconductor grade neon, aluminum production, nickel. But I think the most important factor to take into account is what happens to Russia sourcing, particularly in terms of raw materials. This is where we might observe, as a byproduct, let's say, of the Ukraine invasion, the fact that you have a bunch of companies that are either directly not allowed to operate and to trade with, let's say, Western countries or Western partners, and at the same time, certain companies that are even self-sanctioning themselves. In other words, not doing business with the Russian counterparts with whom they've been dealing in the past. This is where there could be additional problems further down the line for the supply chain, and this is associated with palladium, nickel, and potentially even aluminium. So there could be, I would say, various sources of concerns. Palladium is probably the biggest of the ones that I've just mentioned, just because of the sheer amount of sourcing that takes place, with about 40% of palladium being exported from Russia into a variety of countries. And because 90% of that 40% is going into catalytic converters for automotive, mostly light vehicle applications, this could present a significant threat to car production going forward. Because again, it's not the type of component that you can replace easily, and therefore we have to definitely pay a lot of attention on what happens, not just to Ukraine itself, but also in our dealings with, or at least in the international community's dealings with Russia going forward.
Yeah, and on that point, both of you have touched on this, but obviously, focus has been direct impact in Ukraine. But when we start talking about the sanctions, both government-backed and, as you say, these sort of self-sanctions of different companies, what type of impact do we expect that to have on the automotive industry? How important is Russia from a vehicle sales or vehicle production perspective, and how are automakers responding?
Yeah, go on, I'll take that one, Brian. I think, interestingly, over the last perhaps half a decade or so, Russia's importance, I think we can say has been marginalized, certainly in terms of the size and importance of the market. Those who've been following the European market for a number of years will probably recall the days when, Auto's executives talked about it as being potentially the single largest European market, potential to be bigger than Germany and perhaps a 5 million unit per year marketplace. A lot of those ambitions have been blown off course, particularly since 2014. But the latest events, the way we're interpreting at the moment, would almost permanently delay any ambition at that level. So now we're expecting a market which has been running at about 1.4, 1.5 million units a year recently, to be in the order of probably half that, and a bit more lost from the production side, as I mentioned earlier. If you look at the levels of engagement that we've seen from inward investors, most of it's not arm's length, but the volumes have been fairly marginal. I think again a lot of the ambitions have been rewritten over the last sort of 10 years or so, when VW was making big investments in Kaluga, Stellantis, under the guise of PSA at the time, were making big investments in Kaluga. And really, I think the mainstay of inward investment recently has been, Renault Group, with its control of the local champion, Avtovaz, which of course is commonly known through the Lada brand. We've had some investment from the Japanese and the Koreans. Again, it's perhaps more marginal in terms of its volume effects, and they are very much now sort of coming in line with the idea of self-sanctioning. So we'd expect volumes there to be, if not entirely brought to a standstill, they would be reduced dramatically. Obviously, most of the players from Western Europe, they've self-sanctioned with almost immediate effect, and they will be calling a halt to vehicle production activity. Stellantis and Renault Group, a little more circumspect. I think everybody heard Carlos Tavares talking about, yes, they could call a halt to activity in Russia, but his question was, who does that really impact? Is it the regime, or is it the people who go to work in Stellantis factories every day? I think it's perhaps the problem is most involved for Renault Group because of its effective control of Avtovaz or Lada. It may be difficult for them to continue to operate at the levels that we've seen recently. Certainly, vehicle programs which are reliant on flows of components from further west in Europe, typically, vehicle programs sitting on platforms which have been designed by the Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi alliance, that could be difficult to support in high volumes going forward. And one of the things that we're considering at the moment is, do you almost see kind of a repurposed, reshaped Avtovaz, which, without trying to answer the question ultimately of ownership at this stage, but does that turn into an entity which becomes, more self-sufficient, looks inward to bolster its supply base, and that becomes perhaps the mainstay of domestic manufacturing. And I think de facto it will become continue in its position of mainstay of the number one selling brand on the marketplace. And I think you can also then imagine a kind of a broad view where Western OEMs continue to move out. Perhaps you have this repurposed Avtovaz acting as the mainstay, but potentially growth opportunities could emerge for Chinese OEMs who we know they're already in expansionary mode, and this might give them an opportunity to gain more of a foothold in the Russian marketplace. They're not affected by direct sanctions. I don't think we'd expect them to be self-sanctioning at any time in the near future. And I think their supply chains would be both self-sufficient and isolated from Western sanctions as well.
Yeah, if I may, Brian, from parts manufacturing standpoint, impact from Russia, from a Russian perspective, is not huge, as I was mentioning before. There's only about 500 million worth of parts that get exported from Russia every year, most of which go into Kazakhstan and Belarus. So effectively, it's kind of a bubble that runs on its own, and obviously, by looking at how things go, it will be increasingly that bubble of, let's say, former USSR countries. I think when we look at impacts to the automotive industry, I think we definitely should keep a close eye on aluminium. We saw just what happened back in 2018 to aluminium price when Rusal was sanctioned, and I think this is something that you can see already in aluminum spot prices that have gone from 2018 of $2,000 per ton to $3,500, right? So that's something that will have an impact on the automotive industry, given also the fact that Russia contributes quite importantly to the automotive industry needs. Nickel, very important. Russia exports some 20% of the high-grade nickel that is used for stainless steel and battery cathodes. So again, another major impact, and we've written recently about specifically this point, potentially resulting in massive increases of battery costs, which could make it more difficult for the OEMs to deploy electrification, or more expensive for consumers. And then of course palladium, given that there's a bit of palladium, there's grams of palladium pretty much in any diesel and gasoline car. And if suddenly 40% of that supply stops for any reason, whether it is next week or whether it is out 3 years down the line, this could obviously present quite some severe impacts to the automotive industry, just because of this new set of sanctions to Russia. So yeah, definitely differentiated impacts, but not directly from parts manufacturing, more further down the supply chain.
Yeah, I think we could speculate on all the unintended consequences for days here. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I think all of us are going to stay glued to the news to see how this develops over the coming days and weeks. Big thank you to both of you for joining Autology today.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Thank you.
And thank you to all listeners for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our autology@ihsmarket.com email. And you can find much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit all the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcasts. And we look forward to joining you again with next week's episode. Bye for now.